Judge, this is admin paperwork. The commissioner cleared it. Let's close this and move on.
After more than 4 decades on this bench, I've learned that power, much like poverty, has a look. It isn't always obvious or loud. Sometimes it hides behind a bespoke suit with a perfect cut and a watch that costs more than a mid-sized sedan. And sometimes it stands in front of you with a blind confidence, a specific type of posture that assumes the law is merely a suggestion for those without the right connections. That was the lesson I was reminded of one morning when a high-ranking official walked into my courtroom. He didn't carry fear or humility. He carried a script of privilege, a desperate expectation that his status was the only currency that mattered in this room. That morning began like so many others. I woke up early, before the world started its noise, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey tea, hot, black, and strictly logical. Those early moments helped me prepare for the weight brought into my courtroom, even when the air feels thin with entitlement. By 8:15, I was walking through the courthouse doors, nodding to the staff, listening to the familiar echo of footsteps in the marble hallway. The building has a rhythm, and after all these years, I know it by heart. In my chambers, Christina had the files ready. Neat stacks, precise notes. She knows I have no patience for clutter. I scanned the docket, minor traffic matters, administrative errors, late fees. On paper, nothing suggested the extraordinary. But I've learned never to trust paper alone. Paper doesn't show arrogance. It doesn't show the prearranged phone calls made in back rooms to try and tilt the scales before I even take my seat. When I looked out at my courtroom, I did what I always do. I looked at the faces, not the charges. People sit differently when they think they own the law. They don't hold their papers tightly out of nerves. They leave them scattered on the bench as if they were trash. They don't avoid eye contact. They look at me with a smirk, as if we are members of the same exclusive club. The morning moved steadily, case after case. Some were frustrated, some were apologetic. I listened, and I ruled based on the cold mechanics of the law. Then, Christina called the next name. The moment I looked up, the shift in the room was palpable. A man stood slowly from the bench, not hurried, not defiant, but with the measured ease of someone used to being waited on. His clothes were immaculate, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He walked toward the podium alone, yet he carried the invisible weight of 1,000 political favors. That detail matters. When he reached the podium, he stood very straight, not out of respect, but because he believed he possessed the space. I asked him to state his name. His voice was clear and condescending, as if every syllable was a gift to the record. I explained the charge, a serious violation of building codes and the misuse of public assets. Nothing severe on paper, perhaps, but as I spoke, I watched his face. His jaw didn't tighten. His eyes didn't lower. I could see the calculation happening, not about guilt, but about how to ensure his script was followed. He looked at me, and instead of addressing the charge, he began to mention mutual friends in high places. He truly believed his privilege would start the conversation here. He didn't realize that in this courtroom, my logic has no room for friends. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, as if we were sharing a secret over a private lunch. "Judge," he said, his voice smooth and practiced, "I'm sure you realize there's been a misunderstanding. I was just speaking with the commissioner last night about this very project, and we agreed it was merely a matter of administrative oversight." I watched his face carefully. In his mind, he wasn't making a plea, he was delivering an instruction. He didn't raise his voice or plead. He simply stated it as a fact he expected me to accept without question. The room felt different now. I've seen anger in this courtroom, and I've seen desperate people with nothing left to lose. What stood before me that morning was the look of entitlement, a combination of arrogance mixed with the absolute certainty that the rules were written for someone else. I listened without interrupting. I've learned that when someone tries to trade on a name, they are revealing their own vulnerability, the fear that without their title, they are as empty as the pockets of the people they look down upon. I removed my glasses and set them on the bench. I do that when I want someone to know I am speaking to them directly, stripping away the comfort of their formalities. I leaned forward slightly and asked him if he understood that the commissioner's opinion had no legal weight in a court of law. He paused before answering, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features, something he likely hadn't felt in a long time. I thought about how often people equate success with immunity, how rarely they consider that the higher you climb, the greater your responsibility to the foundation that holds you up. One bad decision followed by a belief that you are untouchable is not a mark of leadership, it is a mark of failure. He stood there, his hands still resting firmly on the edge of the podium, but I noticed a slight shift in his weight. He was no longer grounding himself in confidence. He was beginning to brace himself. I hadn't ruled yet, and I hadn't even addressed the specifics of the building code violations. But I already knew something important. This case wasn't about a missed permit or a public asset misuse. It was about the integrity of the bench and what happens when the script of privilege meets the cold, hard logic of the law. In that moment, the official realized his mutual friends were very far away. And he was, for perhaps the first time in his career, standing completely alone. I looked down at the file, the same neat stack Christina had placed there earlier, and focused on the specific line regarding the diverted funds. He was watching me, waiting for the professional courtesy he assumed was his birthright. I asked him, quite simply, why public assets under his care had been used to improve his private estate. He didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed a slow, weary breath of someone forced to explain the obvious to an inferior. Judge, he began, his tone regaining its polish. This has been customary practice in our department for decades. It's a matter of efficiency, not ethics. I listened without interrupting, watching how carefully he was holding himself together. He wasn't someone trying to avoid responsibility. He was someone trying to redefine it. In his world, customary was a shield against criminal. He explained it like someone who had already replayed the story 100 times in his head to convince himself it was true. But I've learned that when you have everything, mistakes feel like mere inconveniences. You convince yourself that you are not a burden to the system, but that the system exists to serve you. The courtroom stayed silent. There was no shifting, no murmuring. Every person in those benches was listening, whether they meant to or not, waiting to see if the weight of a title could truly tilt the floor. I thought about the people who stood at that same podium earlier, the ones who apologized for being confused, for being late, for simply existing in a space they couldn't afford. They understood that for them, mistakes were expensive. This man, however, viewed his violation as a footnote. I asked him if he understood that custom is not a defense against a statute. He didn't answer quickly. He paused, the calculation behind his eyes sharpening into focus. He said he wanted to do the right thing, but his definition of right was tied to his own convenience. I leaned back slightly and looked at him. Responsibility means different things when your resources are unlimited. When you have the power to change the rules, honesty isn't just a virtue, it's the only thing keeping the system from collapsing into chaos. He didn't plead, and he didn't raise his voice. He stood there, waiting for me to nod and move on to the next case. But the air in the room was growing heavy with the realization that my logic wasn't following his script. He had come to court expecting a handshake. He was starting to realize he was standing in front of a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. He lifted his wrist to check his Patek Philippe, a deliberate, silent gesture designed to broadcast that his time was far more valuable than the legal process currently unfolding around him. There was a sharp edge of impatience in his tone as he spoke of national interests, strategic meetings that could not be delayed, and high-level decisions that were supposedly hanging in the balance while he stood at this podium. I have witnessed this particular brand of temporal arrogance many times over 40 years. It is the belief that one's private schedule supersedes the public's right to accountability. To him, waiting in a courtroom was not a procedure. It was a personal insult, a stain on his perceived importance. I met his gaze, stripping the room of its artificial urgency, and reminded him calmly that in this courtroom, the only clock that carries weight is the one sitting on my bench. I told him that accountability is not a luxury you attend to, only when your calendar has a gap. It is a debt you owe to the society that granted you power. I could see his shoulders tighten beneath his expensive wool suit, a silent, bitter reaction to the realization that he had lost all control over the flow of events. When privilege ceases to be a shield, panic often travels much faster than reason. Most people who stand at this podium are desperate to leave because they fear an uncertain future. This official wanted to leave because of a deep-seated arrogance that convinced him he belonged to a world where rules are merely decorative. But my duty is to remind him that the isolation power provides is a dangerous illusion. When you stand alone with your pride, no network of influence is thick enough to guard you against the cold logic of the truth. I asked him for specifics, not the vague strategic goals he had been reciting, but hard numbers regarding how his public service time was actually used to supervise the assets he was accused of misappropriating. He hesitated, and for the first time, a visible crack appeared in that polished exterior. He couldn't answer directly. Instead, he retreated into buzzwords about developmental objectives. But justice is not administered based on far-off visions. It is based on the integrity of immediate actions and absolute honesty. The courtroom fell into a profound silence, one that stretched longer than necessary. I let that silence linger, forcing him to feel the weight of having no scripted defense to cling to. He was no longer an authoritative figure delivering commands. He was simply a defendant, struggling to justify misconduct before a system that values integrity over political status. The harsh reality is that privilege never makes you great. It only makes the moment you fall more painful and much louder when logic begins to exercise its supreme authority. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence of the courtroom act as a mirror for the man standing before me. He had spent the last few minutes using the word burden, referring to the heavy weight of his office and the unfortunate pressures that led to his minor administrative lapses. I paused, allowing that word to hang in the air. In my courtroom, I have seen the cruel reality of that word. I have seen it in the eyes of the person who walked miles to get here because transportation costs money they didn't have. I have seen it in the hands of those who hold their papers so tightly because they are afraid of losing the only proof of their existence. Poverty convinces people they are a burden to society, that they are in the way, and that their very presence needs to be justified. But when a man of his stature uses that word to excuse the misappropriation of public trust, it is a different kind of burden. It is the burden of a guilty conscience trying to dress itself in the robes of a martyr. I told him calmly that the law doesn't equate high-pressure demands with a license to ignore ethics. I asked him if he had anyone truly supporting his actions, anyone who could stand beside him and justify the diversion of these assets. He shook his head slowly. He was on his own, not because he lacked friends, but because even the most powerful allies vanish when the cold light of logic hits a paper trail that doesn't lie. I scan the docket every morning, and while the paper doesn't show hunger or isolation, it certainly shows the calculated steps of entitlement. This official had stood at the podium with a posture of control, believing that his burden made him exempt from the rules the rest of the world must follow. I reminded him that standing there with nothing to hide is a form of dignity, but standing there with everything to hide is simply a failure of character. Responsibility means different things when your resources are vast. It means you have no excuse for being lost when you hold the map. The room remained still, everyone watching as his carefully constructed script continued to unravel. He had come into this court expecting privilege to be his savior. Instead, he was discovering that in this room, accountability is the only thing that preserves worth. Being alone at the podium can take courage for the vulnerable, but for the powerful, it is often the first time they are forced to see themselves as they truly are. A person accountable for their own choices, with no title to hide behind. The official shifted his weight again, the unnatural silence of the room finally beginning to erode the last of his composure. He asked if the court would consider a deferred arrangement, a sophisticated euphemism for a penalty that would stay hidden from the public record. I've seen entitlement take many forms in this courtroom, but this was the most transparent, the request to be spared, the one thing that truly matters, the consequences of being seen for who you really are. I told him calmly that the law is not a negotiation conducted in whispers behind closed doors. I told him that justice is not about doing what is simple or convenient. It is about doing what is right. I watched his face as the realization settled in. The calculation behind his eyes was no longer about which mutual friend to call, but about survival. He looked surprised by the lack of flexibility in my tone. Most people in authority are not used to hearing a no that carries the weight of a gavel. I told him that discretion exists for a reason. It allows judges to recognize reality when the cold rules of the system don't fit neatly into the human experience. However, discretion is a tool for the vulnerable, not a shield for the powerful who have willfully ignored their obligations. He began to apologize not for the diversion of assets, but for the misunderstanding. I've noticed that poverty and isolation often teach people to apologize for their very existence, for being confused, or for being in the way. But for a man like him, an apology is often just another part of the script, a tactical move to regain a sense of inclusion in the club of the elite. I stopped him gently. I told him he didn't need to apologize for the procedure, he needed to address the facts. I leaned forward, looking past his expensive suit and into the reality of the evidence Christina had laid out. I told him that responsibility and compassion are not opposites, but they must be earned through honesty. He had spent his career believing that his actions were quiet on paper, but in this room, they had become very loud. As I prepared to deliver the final ruling, the official didn't look like a leader anymore. He looked like someone who had just realized that when the lights of the courtroom are on, there is nowhere left to hide. The official stood there, eyes searching mine, clearly expecting the discretion he had seen me apply to the cases that came before his. He had witnessed me dismiss fines for the desperate and assumed that if I could be kind to the poor, I would surely be flexible for the powerful. But he had missed the most fundamental lesson of this bench. Flexibility is a lifeline for those whose backs are already broken by life. For those who stand straight with the weight of authority, the law must be an unyielding wall. He thought his title entitled him to a different version of reality. But in this room, reality is the only thing that doesn't fit neatly into a script. I delivered the ruling with the same cold, mechanical precision I apply to every docket. I didn't add unnecessary pressure to his situation, but I refused to remove the weight he had willfully placed on the public trust. I imposed the maximum fine, not as an act of retribution, but as a restoration of his humanity. I told him that being alone at the podium does not mean being forgotten, and that accepting the absolute consequence of his choices was the only way to preserve what was left of his dignity. For a long moment, he didn't react. It wasn't disbelief or shock. It was the paralyzed silence of a mind that had never prepared for the possibility of the word no. When the truth finally landed, the tears in his eyes didn't come from a fear of poverty, but from the sudden, terrifying loss of the script he had lived by for decades. I told him he didn't need to apologize to the court, but to the people whose integrity he had treated as a mere administrative oversight. I told him that true dignity includes allowing yourself to feel the full weight of your relief and your regret when the verdict arrives. He whispered a thank you, but his voice caught in a way that had nothing to do with political theater. It was the sound of a man who had finally been seen as a person, not just a title. I didn't let that moment rush past, because justice requires a pause for the truth to settle. I told him that this ruling meant he was seen not as an official, not as a name on a file, but as a human being accountable to the same logic as the man who walked miles to be here this morning. Justice doesn't end when the fine is paid. Sometimes, justice means pointing someone towards stability by stripping away the chaos of their own arrogance. I watched as he held the court order in both hands, clutching it carefully as if it were fragile, as if that piece of paper were the only thing keeping him from disappearing. And when you have everything, sometimes a simple piece of paper that tells the truth is the only thing that actually matters. I told him to take it one step at a time. I told him not to be ashamed of the rebuilding process that follows a public fall. And I told him that coming to court and facing his reality took a kind of courage that his mutual friends would never understand. He nodded slowly and stepped away from the podium. As he walked back to his seat, I noticed something subtle. His posture had changed. He was still tired, still alone, still uncertain of his future, but he wasn't folded inward into his own entitlement anymore. He was, for the first time in a very long while, simply a man standing in the light. As Christina called the next case, I sat back and reflected on the shift that had just occurred. These are the moments that remind me why discretion exists and why the law cannot be applied without a deep understanding of humanity. Arrogance is often loud in person, but it is silenced the moment it is forced to face the cold, mechanical reality of the record. I watched as the official sat down alone, clutching that small piece of paper, the court order, not as a weapon of influence, but as a map for his own reconstruction. I wondered where he would go next, Now that the script of his former life had been torn away, I wondered how many doors he would knock on where his name no longer carried the same weight, and how many times he would have to learn to hear no without resentment. But I also wondered what it feels like to walk out of a courtroom lighter than you walked in, not because you escaped the law, but because you finally found the truth. As court continued, I found myself more aware of the isolation that exists at every level of society. Who else was sitting alone? Who else was looking like they were carrying more than they said? Once you notice the weight of a person's story, it is everywhere. That day, as the docket moved forward, I realized something important. Logic doesn't fix the broken systems of power, but it can interrupt the cycle of entitlement. And sometimes that interruption is the difference between a person continuing to fail and a person finally choosing to change. I knew this story wasn't finished yet, because when someone leaves a courtroom with their sense of dignity restored through accountability, the real story begins after they walk out the door. At home that evening, I told my wife about the man who came to court expecting privilege and left with a verdict. She listened carefully and then said something that stayed with me. Sometimes people don't need to be fixed, they need to be believed. She was right. People don't rise because they are punished into it. They rise when someone, even a judge with cold logic, believes they are capable of something better. After more than 40 years on this bench, I still believe that the law works best when it remembers the human being standing in front of it. Justice should never make people feel disposable, whether they have nothing or they have everything. It should remind them that they matter and that their actions carry consequences that define their worth. I'm Judge Boyd. I believe that dignity is not a reward for success. It is the starting point for a life lived with integrity. Thank you for listening.